All right, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Vivi Tren, and I am a second-year OB/GYN resident here at Kaiser Santa Clara. The name of my talk today is Incarceration and Health, and I want to thank everybody for joining us today. We have a pretty diverse audience, so this has been given as a noon conference for the internal medicine residents at Santa Clara Valley, right down the street from where I am now, and also is being hosted on the Education for All OB/GYN website, which was born out of the pandemic to support continued resident learning during this time when a lot of us may be working from home here or there. I want to start by saying, giving a big thank you to my friends over at Valley. I know that a lot of you may be taking care of people who are in and out of our prison system, and as a resident currently at Kaiser, I do not currently take care of a lot of these folks, but I did start out at UC Davis as a family medicine resident, and we served as a county hospital and was contracted with the county jail, and so I did take care of a lot of folks and had so many questions, and yeah, a lot of what I saw disturbed me, whether it was having to take care of women in labor who were being constantly monitored by prison guards who'd come in, or knowing that we had to separate mom from baby so quickly. And a lot of what I witnessed and experienced there led me to do some research on this topic and present it at Grand Rounds a few weeks ago. And I'm also now currently involved in some different organizing and activism around ending mass incarceration, which I've worked with some of you guys with, and I'll be talking about some of those opportunities to get involved at the end of this. So thank you very much for your time. Okay, so an overview of today's talk. We're going to take a look at mass incarceration today and the reality of it, and then look into the history of it. Then we're going to talk about the impacts on health, impacts on women's health, maternal health, and families. Give some time to talk about incarceration right now during the COVID-19 pandemic. Then going to highlighting some examples of resistance and reform working towards decarceration and abolition of mass incarceration as we know it. And then go into some next steps and actions we can take. So for some disclosures and disclaimers, obviously this is just scratching the surface. As I'm sure all of you know, this is a huge topic with years and years of scholarship and research around this that I'm highlighting today. And there are many things that we don't have time to discuss in depth, including immigration, detention, restorative justice, and other alternatives to prison, the private prison industry, the ongoing disenfranchisement and discrimination that follows felons once they complete their sentences, and of course the taxpayer costs. Unsurprising to anybody, mass incarceration has huge financial costs in our society, which has been a significant argument for states scaling back. But today I'm not going to focus on that because I want to focus on the human cost. So let's start with some definitions. So jails versus prisons, a big question that often comes up. So jails are local facilities, usually under the jurisdiction of a city, a local district, or a county. They are meant to be short-term holding facilities for those awaiting trial or sentencing, although you will see that oftentimes people are actually held in prisons as well. Prisons are institutional facilities under the jurisdiction of the state or federal government where convicted offenders serve longer sentences. Currently, about 8 to 9% of prisoners are held in private prisons. ICE detention centers are very variable. They are sometimes contracted to county jails. An example of this is that Yuba County Jail is an ICE detention center, but sometimes they are private prisons, an example being the Otay Mesa Detention Center in San Diego. Bail is the temporary release of an accused person awaiting trial on condition that a sum of money be lodged to guarantee their appearance in court. Bond is similar to bail, but is the term used in the case of immigration detention. So let's begin. The United States has the largest prison population in the world. The United States is home to 5% of the world's population and 25% of the world's prisoners. Each year in the United States, approximately the same number of men graduate from college as are released from prison. As of 2016, 7 million people were involved in our carceral system, whether they were incarcerated, on probation, or on parole. Black Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population and 40% of our incarcerated population. 2/3 of people currently sitting in jail have not been convicted of a crime. This practice is known as pretrial detention. So, how did we get here? Go back in history to find out. So, going back to the founding of this country and looking at prisons in our colonial era. So actually, the founders of the U.S. rebelled against the British approach to crime and punishment. 4 out of 10 amendments in our Constitution protect the rights of the accused, which is really a statement of priorities. This was a distinctly different approach from many European countries at the time. On the right here, we have a photo of Alexis de Tocqueville. He was a French sociologist who traveled to the United States in the 1830s and wrote down a lot of his observations, which is how we know how we have a lot of his historical records. And he actually wrote really favorably about the kind of concept, the focus on mercy and innocent until proven guilty, and all these components that really defined the approach to crime and punishment in the colonial United States. So then what happened? What happened is that the Civil War ended and slavery was abolished. In 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, which officially abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime. With the ending of slavery, this sent the South into an economic depression after the loss of their free labor. Swiftly after the end of the Civil War, a series of laws known as the Black Codes were introduced. The Black Codes were laws outlawing common conduct among Black folks. They were laws against things like assembling in groups, going to church, learning to read and write. There's primary sources that document violations like walking without a purpose or walking at night. These are mostly associated with the post-war southern states, but in reality, they actually existed in northern states as well, preceding and following the end of the Civil War. These Black Codes swept thousands of Black people into prisons. Which brings me to the first point that I really want to emphasize, which is that the end of slavery marked the nation's first prison boom. And thus, we can conclude that modern mass incarceration does not descend from that colonial crime and punishment system. It descends directly from slavery. So once these Black folks were swept into prisons, as previously described, this led to a new practice known as convict leasing. State penal authorities would deploy imprisoned people to help rebuild the South. These convicts were rented out to private companies to farm land or work in coal mines. The conditions were brutal and often harsher than slavery, and many historians believe that this is because slave owners no longer had the incentive to keep their investments, quote, alive and healthy, and there's no longer incentive for longevity. And this labor was so cheap that if a leased convict died on the job, they would just rent another one. This practice included children, as you can see in the photo here, and there was no supervision by states. This was codified in law. In 1871, the Virginia Supreme Court stated that rules that incarcerated persons were slaves of the state. This was extremely profitable, and I think it's extremely important to remember that these people were imprisoned for things like walking or reading. The practice of convict leasing largely died out by the 1920s and was replaced by another practice known as chain gangs, which was a group of prisoners who were chained together to perform physically challenging work. Incarcerated people would toil on public works, not just in private companies. They were doing things like building roads or clearing lands. This population was still disproportionately Black. For example, in 1928, Texas was operating 12 state prison farms, many with chain gangs, and nearly 100% of the workers on them were Black. This was largely phased out by the 1950s, although a very disturbing fact is that this was briefly reinstated in some states during the 1990s tough on crime wave, which I'm going to review later. And actually an interesting fact is that this still exists in Maricopa County in Arizona, where people can opt in to work on a chain gang in exchange for a reduction of their sentence. So meanwhile, in the North, so from 1910 to 1970 was a period that's known as the Great Migration. 6 million Black people fled the South to northern urban centers. They were fleeing racial terrorism, groups like the KKK, and economic exclusion. By 1910, 90% of Black Americans lived in the South. By 1970, this number was only 53%. This coincided at the time with an influx of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe as well. So essentially, these cities were seeing big changes in demographics. With these changing demographics, there was increased anxiety about crime. The dominant white class connected criminality to three groups: lower class whites, immigrants, and Black Americans. However, social reformers thought that white and immigrant criminality could be ameliorated through educational programs and social programs, and really a lot of anti-poverty programs. But on the other hand, Black criminality was explained by these growing theories of racial inferiority that were supported by science. This time period coincides with the rise of eugenics that led to a lot of forced sterilizations and was extremely popular. It was this idea that traits like aggression and criminality could be found on the level of DNA. At the same time, over time, these immigrant groups from Southern and Eastern Europe were increasingly grouped into whiteness, and these fears were really placed onto the burden of Black communities specifically. With the growing fear of crime, there was intensified policing and mandatory sentencing, and state prison populations increased 67% between 1926 and 1940. Over here on the right, I have a photo of an extremely popular film at the time called The Birth of a Nation, which many of you may have heard about. This was a movie that told the story of a post-war Southern white family from a very sympathetic point of view, and really popularized the idea of Black people as aggressive and inherently criminal. It featured actors who were white actors in blackface, threatening white women, and had a famous scene of a white woman who would rather commit suicide than be raped by this white actor in blackface. And this was extremely popular, not only in the South, but also in northern cities, and is an example of these widespread ideas during this time that justified increasing incarceration of people of color. In the 1940s, we did see an era of prison reform. We saw the introduction of the new correctional institutional model, which is a little bit more similar to what we might be more familiar with today. The working conditions became less harsh. There was more programming of recreation, visitation, increased communication. There was educational and vocational and therapeutic programming, but what's important to note is that Black prisoners and other ethnic minorities were excluded from these reforms. This brings us to the 1960s, when there was a significant rise in law and order rhetoric. As we all know, this correlates with the time when Black folks began to win significant social and political gains through the civil rights movement. Of course, there were riots that broke out in several cities, and several politicians took advantage of this and connected civil rights actions to crime, despite the fact that by definition and by necessity, the vast majority of these actions were nonviolent. We have a lot of written examples from this in history. For example, Richard Nixon in a 1968 speech at the Republican National Convention accepting the presidential nomination, he said, "Let us recognize that some of our courts and their decisions have gone too far in weakening the peace forces against the criminal forces in this country. Let those who have the responsibility be dedicated to the great principles of civil rights. But let them also recognize that the first civil right of every American is to be free from domestic violence." So we see him campaigning on this idea of needing to control this wave of crime and winning an election based on this. This is another really powerful quote from the era from John Ehrlichman, who was Nixon's domestic policy chief at the time, something he said in retrospect. He said, "The Nixon campaign and the Nixon White House had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. I'll let that quote speak for itself. So this rising war on crime, war on drugs, also correlated at the time, coincided at the time with a significant economic recession in the 1970s. On the left here, we have a picture of Detroit, a city that I think has come to be associated with significant changes during this era. As we know, during the 1950s, it was probably one of the largest growing economies in the world, the home of the automobile industry, and is now known for significant decay, one of the cities that declared bankruptcy. Black men in urban centers were the hardest hit by these significant economic changes in this recession. This coincided with white flight to the suburbs, which left Black folks in decaying urban centers with few services or legitimate employment opportunities. Thus, this allowed drug and other illicit markets to take hold. And in the 1980s and 90s, as we saw the introduction and more of these drug markets, this also coincided with increasingly punitive policing. And I know a really popular book that's out there is Michelle Obama's memoir, Becoming, and I think she writes really beautifully into a pretty widespread audience about this time period, about seeing white flight in her very own neighborhood in Chicago. And so I just wanted to highlight that because I know a lot of folks have read that. That brings us to 1970, which historians and criminologists all widely acknowledge is the birth of mass incarceration. This graphic, I think, speaks for itself. We see this steep and unprecedented rise after a largely stable prison population in the preceding decades. In 1970, there were just under 200,000 people who were incarcerated. By 1985, this number became just under 500,000. And by 2008, there were 1.6 million people in prisons and jails. This brings us to the 1980s and 2000s. So the war on drugs, as previously mentioned, was started by Nixon, but it was really championed by Reagan. He successfully passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which introduced 29 new mandatory minimum sentences. To give you guys some context, there have been only 55 mandatory minimum sentences to date, and so the majority of them were passed in this very short period of time. One interesting component to note is that there was a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity in crack versus powder cocaine. These substances were, on a molecular and in every other way, extremely similar. Crack cocaine was used more predominantly in Black urban communities, and powder cocaine was used among more affluent white suburban communities. This on the right showed headlines of the day with this growing and very popular notion of this concept of crack kids or crack babies, which were babies born to mothers who were using. And there was this idea that crack cocaine was particularly damaging and led to kids who were violent and particularly ill. And obviously, as physicians, and many of us on the call are obstetricians, we know that substances in utero are obviously ill-advised, but we also know that there is certainly no worse outcomes with crack cocaine versus powder cocaine versus many other stimulants versus alcohol. And the racialization of this project is really clear. Unfortunately, during the Clinton and Bush and Obama years to follow, there were virtually no changes to these laws on a federal level, the exception being that President Obama did reverse or did rectify this sentencing disparity in crack versus powder cocaine. But other than that, there were very little federal changes to this. And in 1994, Clinton passed the crime bill, which is famous now. They, both Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton have gone on record acknowledging that this was a mistake, but this crime bill introduced a lot of components that significantly increased the prison population, including the 3 strikes law, which would automatically, for a third conviction, have someone serve a life sentence. It introduced many more mandatory minimums, and very importantly, it gave states $12.5 billion in order to enforce something called truth in sentencing laws, which was ensuring that people who were convicted would serve at least 85% of their sentence, really not making them eligible for parole. And this financial incentive stimulated states to significantly build up their prisons, contracting with private prisons or building their own prisons. And then, of course, once you build prisons, you have a budget and you have to keep the prison going. And so this really led to a huge rise in the private prison industry and incentivized facilities to incarcerate more people. And just to talk a little bit about the labor component of all this, so looking at prison labor today. On the right here, we have a graphic from the Prison Policy Initiative that shows the average wages for laborers in prison. I think that they speak for themselves, and you can see that in many prisons, people get paid nothing for their labor. On the left here, we have a photo of low security inmates in a state prison picking watermelons. Prison labor is found in the supply chains of so many goods and products and services that we enjoy today, including Starbucks holiday products, certain brands of ground meat, military gear, McDonald's uniforms, and it's really hard to track down companies where in their supply chains this is being used. But this made the headlines a couple of years ago. As we know, California has seen a lot of wildfires lately, and 30 to 40% of California's firefighters are prisoners. In 2014, Kamala Harris's office was featured in headlines for basically saying that they could not enact a certain parole reform measure that was going to allow some decarceration because that would severely affect our wildfire labor force, who on average make about $2 a day for their work. And I think that being leaked was incredibly important because it reminds us that we have this narrative that prisoners are incarcerated in order to serve their time to be rehabilitated, but there's obviously this incredible economic incentive to keep people incarcerated. And I just want to remind us of a point I made a few minutes back, that modern mass incarceration does not descend from our colonial crime and punishment system. It comes directly from slavery. And we have never overcome as a society this addiction to a cheap or free racialized labor force. And mass incarceration is just one example of this. All of the information I presented here is the subject of these two phenomenal works that I'm sure many of you have read or watched, and I cannot recommend more highly The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, and of course the documentary 13th by Ava DuVernay, which can be found on Netflix. Something I can recommend during shelter in place if you guys have some extra time. Okay, so we've completed the history of incarceration in the United States, and now we'll move on to the impacts on health. So we know that prisons are deeply unhealthy environments where substandard meals and nutrition are served. It's rampant with violence and sexual abuse. There is overcrowding, poor sanitation and ventilation, and vermin in solitary confinement. And these are just a handful of problems that were highlighted in this workshop in Washington, D.C. that brought together a lot of different research groups on the impacts of incarceration on health. I'm going to go over a few key studies that were summarized in this excellent report that was published in December 2018 jointly by UCSF and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. You can Google it and get the full documentation online, and I highly recommend it. It's called Mass Incarceration Threatens Health Equity in America, and it reminds us that any of us who are dedicated to health equity, we cannot ignore mass incarceration in that pursuit. So 1/3 of illness-related deaths in state prisons from 2001 to 2004 resulted from conditions not present at the time of admission. This study suggests that prison itself leads to illness and leads to chronic stress and a lot of chronic health issues. Many longitudinal studies show strong, pervasive links between incarceration and multiple adverse health indicators. On average, adult inmates are released from prison with more chronic medical problems than before admission. A 2015 study of New York State parolees over 10 years showed that each year spent in prison corresponded with a 2-year reduction in life expectancy. And in another study, in the 2 weeks following release from prison, mortality rates of former inmates is 13 times higher than the general population. We know that the health impacts follow somebody far beyond just the time that they spend in prison. Once folks leave prison, their sentence follows them for life, and ex-felons face difficulty accessing health care and face discrimination in all realms of life, including employment, the ability to get a loan, housing, education. Any of us who've ever applied for a job know that we have to disclose if we've ever been convicted of a felony, and this leads to continued marginalization and health disparities. There are also rippling and widespread impacts on children and families. 2.6 million children are growing up with one or both parents behind bars. 10 million children have experienced parental incarceration, which increases children's risk of so many health outcomes: drug use, criminality, HIV and AIDS, asthma, high cholesterol, mental health disorders, and it reduces people's potential economic development and widens existing economic gaps. I don't know if other programs are experiencing this, but a lot of us right now are completing our ACEs training in order to receive continued Medi-Cal funding. And we know that, there are so many adverse childhood events that are wrapped up in the experience of parental incarceration. And so this is affecting multiple generations. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to the impact specifically on women's health and reproductive health and maternal health. I'm going to review 2 committee opinions from ACOG, which is the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology. For those of you who are not OBGYNs, this is kind of our main body. We follow all their guidelines and all their care, and they have 2 outstanding pieces specifically on incarceration and women's health. I'm going to go a little bit quickly through this since I know not everybody on the call is an OB. Okay, so starting first with Committee Opinion 511, so this is specifically about pregnant women. They start by giving us the numbers. So between 1990 and 2009, the number of incarcerated women increased 153%, and most are incarcerated for nonviolent crimes. 6 to 10% of incarcerated women are pregnant, and that number is highest in local jails and slightly higher in juvenile facilities. ACOG gives us recommended care for people experiencing incarceration, including a good history and screening everybody for pregnancy. They have a lot of other recommendations, and I will say that these are largely aspirational, and they acknowledge that these are largely aspirational. We know that the standard of care is not provided in the vast majority of these facilities. They recommend, standard of care, perinatal, pregnancy counseling, and abortion services, access to substance use treatment, and prompt initiation of opioid-assisted therapy with methadone or buprenorphine. We know that this is very variable. In a lot of facilities, methadone may be available specifically to pregnant women because there's been a lot of work around the importance of this, especially with the health to the fetus, but the availability of buprenorphine or Suboxone is highly variable, and in the vast majority of places not available. They recommend testing and treating for HIV, screening for mental health disorders, and providing dietary supplements because we know that there's a lot of malnutrition in these places. They recommend delivery services being available in a licensed hospital that can also provide high-risk services and to provide postpartum contraception during incarceration. They have a couple selected points that they talk about: work restrictions while incarcerated, full 4 to 6 weeks of recovery. They talk about the risk of falls, and they talk specifically about correctional officers not needing to be routinely present. They strongly recommend avoiding separating the mother and the infant, which is actually rarely provided. They advocate for prison nurseries or alternative sentencing that are community-based. Prison nurseries are essentially usually an isolated part of a prison or maybe a separate facility in which mom and baby can be together in the initial weeks and months of life. This is really only available in a handful of states in the United States, although it's a common practice in other countries, and is often available only to women who have given birth while incarcerated. And there's a lot of pushback against prison nurseries from people who believe that it is unconstitutional or unethical for children to be in any kind of incarcerated setting. But in reality, we know that when adequate resources are available for prison nursery programs, women who participate show lower rates of recidivism, and their children show no adverse effect as a result of their participation. We know how important that bonding period is, and this has been shown to prevent foster care placement and allow bonding. This is a photo from a really excellent long-form piece out of NPR of a prison nursery in Washington that I recommend you guys give a read. Of course, ACOG loves breastfeeding, of course, and so they always recommend that breastfeeding or pumping should be made available with the ability to freeze and store and transport milk. And I know this from seeing this up close during my time as a resident at UC Davis that this is largely aspirational. It's extremely hard to keep up with breastfeeding in prison, and this essentially doesn't happen. But the recommendation is another argument for prison nurseries or alternative sentencing. 38 states have failed to institute policies requiring that incarcerated pregnant women receive adequate prenatal care. 41 states do not require prenatal nutrition counseling or appropriate nutrition, and 48 states do not offer pregnant women HIV screening. The ACOG committee opinion then goes on to spend a lot of time talking about shackling, which is a big topic in OBGYN, and the definition of shackling is the use of any physical restraint or mechanical device to control the movement of a prisoner's body or limbs. Until 2007, there was essentially no kind of federal guideline on this. Since 2007, there have been several federal and national bodies that speak out against the use of shackling during labor or delivery and immediate postpartum, as you can see here. Unfortunately, these guidelines are voluntary and they are not mandatory. And 36 states and ICE do not limit the use of restraints on pregnant women during labor. And we know that this practice happens every day. For the sake of confidentiality, I can't give too many details, but a very good friend of mine who's a resident witnessed one of her patients being shackled during labor, and it was a very difficult process to seek legal recourse for this patient, and so we know that this happens. ACOG talks about how this practice compromises healthcare and is demeaning and inhumane. It's almost always unnecessary. Most incarcerated women are nonviolent offenders, and there have been no documented escape attempts during labor. It interferes with the need for a lot of rapid action during labor in order to ensure patient safety. And they recommend that if a restraint is ever seen being used, a report should be filed and there should be consequences. Examples of restraints' health effects during labor, labor associated with nausea and vomiting, the need to break falls, the need to quickly evaluate. Hypertensive disease is directly responsible for almost 18% of maternal deaths, and seizures in shackles is particularly unsafe. There's an increased risk of venous thromboembolism through the inability to ambulate and interferes with normal labor. We often need to quickly intervene in the case of a shoulder dystocia, a hemorrhage, an operative delivery, or to do an emergency C-section, and it inhibits immediate postpartum bonding. The committee opinion ends with some recommendations. Again, on the left, we have these sort of aspirational recommendations of state policies for mental care, education for people who provide health care in correctional facilities. And they also recommend that all of us as physicians should be advocates on the state and federal level, that we should partner with organizations to oppose shackling. I hadn't really considered this before, but they recommend that physicians gain representation on the boards of correctional health organizations so that from within we can ensure that standard of care is being provided. Okay. Moving on to the other committee opinion, which is about reproductive health care outside of pregnancy among incarcerated women. There's a lot of overlap between the two committee opinions. This does provide a little bit of different information. So they mentioned one study in which 27% of incarcerated women had chlamydia and 8% had gonorrhea. This is compared with much, much lower rates in the general population. They talk about a 2008 study in which 2% of women in prisons were positive for HIV, which is much higher than the general population. 56 to 62% of women in prisons are parents of minor children, and 70% of women in pretrial detention who don't even have a conviction have children under the age of 16. They talk about women's experience attempting to obtain an abortion during incarceration, which varies widely. A survey of correctional health officials showed that 68% indicated that women in their prisons were allowed to have an abortion, but only 54% helped arrange appointments. I also think it's really important to note that this is a survey of correctional health officials, not of incarcerated people themselves whose experience are undoubtedly quite different. We know that sexual victimization is rampant, and in one study was shown to be as high as 10.8% in prisons, and as high as 5.3% being by a staff member. Obviously, mental health and substance use disorders, the rates of these are extremely high, somewhere in the 70s%, and access to appropriate care is extremely limited. The committee opinion then shines light on what healthcare within correctional facilities actually looks like. I imagine that this is a black box for many of us, and it certainly has been for me. So it's really variable. It's sometimes on site, or sometimes people who are acutely ill are transported to hospital who have contracts with local hospitals. Historically, there was a sick call model where physicians would come in if there was a sick inmate, but increasingly we've been moving more towards primary care. One challenge of this is that facilities are often built for men and are not tailored to meet women's health needs. And financing prison health care is very challenging. In general, Medicaid cannot be used for jail and prison care. In terms of health care that's provided in prisons, there is no accreditation required. There is no central organization to which facilities are accountable, and all the guidelines are voluntary. So WellPath is a private healthcare company that is one of the main contractors for a lot of the county jails and the private prisons in this area, including ICE facilities. And I know a lot of folks who do a lot of advocacy work where they meet with prisoners and detainees and have seen the kind of care that's provided, and it's very variable, and also it's very difficult to obtain records to see what exactly the kind of care is being done for folks who are incarcerated. This is a brief shout out to people, friends of mine who you may know, especially the physician on the right, who do provide care for incarcerated people. On the left are two friends of mine who are physicians, Dr. Katie Brooks and Dr. Hayan Ramirez, and on the right is Marcy Abari. And this is just my tribute to excellent local facilities who provide funding for amazing doctors to do what they can to serve people in a really unjust and unsafe environment. Marcy Abari, as you guys know, works at the Reentry Clinic, which is across the street from Santa Clara County Jail. And the message when I spoke with all three of them, the three of them who've taught me a lot of what I'm presenting, is that as we move towards decarceration, it's going to be extremely important to provide wraparound services, because oftentimes what happens is people get out of jail and have nowhere to go. Their care is interrupted. Perhaps they just got their last dose of methadone from within jail and don't know where to get their next dose. And so that is the work of a lot of folks, including the reentry clinic, which is across the street from Santa Clara County Jail. And I want to commend UCSF and Valley Medical Center for really providing this care in this critical time for people. Okay, that was just a brief interlude to shout them out, just to lighten the mood a little bit and give us some hope. Back to the committee opinion. So the ACOG ends with recommendations, the general principle being that care for incarcerated people should be provided using the same guidelines as for people who are not incarcerated, which is pretty self-evident, but again, largely aspirational. This committee opinion takes their advocacy recommendations a step further, and in addition to recommending improved conditions within prisons and reform of conditions in prisons and the standard of care, they also say that we should all be advocating for decarceration, for things like making sure that people who are stuck in pretrial detention get out. They don't even have a conviction. Why should they be stuck in jail? For advocating for juveniles to be redirected to community-based programs instead of being tried and detained like adults. And so I thought it was extremely powerful that our primary, organization, ACOG, is advocating for decarceration. I thought that was a really important take-home point. Okay, so back to our agenda, 12:56 p.m. So moving on to incarceration during COVID-19. We know that COVID-19 makes jails, prisons, and detention centers deadly. These are just a few of the headlines that we've seen in the past weeks and months. Cook County Jail in Chicago has been one of the top worst outbreaks of COVID-19 in the United States. We've seen a huge outbreak in Rikers of both jail guards and prisons. And down here in the bottom right, we have a headline highlighting the first death of a detainee in an ICE detention center from COVID-19. In the upper right-hand corner here, this is right in our backyard. This is a graph showing cases per 1,000 people in Alameda County versus Santa Rita Jail, which is Alameda County's jail. And we can see that although the rate of COVID-19 is fairly low in this county, it's astronomically higher in the setting of incarceration. This pandemic makes what we know to be unhealthy environments even more deadly. Many people have spoken out about the need for prison reform and decarceration, especially during COVID-19. I thought one of the most powerful ones and one of the most relevant ones to us was by the American Public Health Association, who published this in the American Journal of Public Health at the beginning of April. So the good news is that decarceration during COVID-19 is happening, although it is highly variable. So back at the end of March, when things were really starting to ramp up and become very clearly very serious in New York, there was an ICE detention center in the New York, New Jersey area that ended up releasing all its detainees after there were some COVID positive patients. I think this is incredibly important to note that folks who are locked up in ICE detention centers, the vast majority have not even been convicted with anything remotely resembling a violent crime. They have the civil offense of having crossed the border or overstaying a visa. I mean, obviously that's a whole other topic that we can get into, but I thought that was a real important step forward when they did this. Unfortunately, it has not spread to other ICE facilities. Right now in the Bay Area, we are overall doing a really good job. San Francisco currently has a record low number of people locked up inside jail. It is around 700, which is the lowest it's been since the 1950s. And down here in the bottom right corner, we have a photo showing that on May 12th, San Francisco supervisors voted 10-1 to shut down 850 Bryant, which was a jail in San Francisco. This was at the conclusion of like a 7 years long campaign of local grassroots activists to shut down this jail that does not make the community safer. And so that was a recent victory that happened just this month. Here in Santa Clara County, there's been a 30% reduction in jail population since mid-April. So this is a natural segue into the next part of my talk, which is about resistance and reform. So in recent years, states have begun to realize the profound flaws and costs of mass incarceration. So we can see here, this is from the Vera Justice Institute, that our prison population reached a peak in 2009, and over the past 10, 11 years, this has slowly started to go down. It will take continued pressure and a long time to end mass incarceration. Like I said before, there have been virtually no decarceration or criminal justice reform measures on the federal level, but there have been these reforms pretty much in every state on the state policy level. So here's an example of a bunch of different reforms, and I'm just going to give one example of each one. So bail reform, essentially, as I mentioned earlier, 2/3 of people who are currently sitting in jail do not have a conviction. They are only sitting there because they cannot afford to pay bail. This is obviously a discriminatory practice that disproportionately affects the poor. So an example of bail reform is very close to home. This November, on November 3rd, when we go to the polls, Californians will get to vote on a referendum. Essentially, in August 2018, Governor Jerry Brown signed into law a measure that would end cash bail in California and replace it instead with risk assessments that would release people based on their risk to public safety rather than based on their ability to pay. This was passed, but then has been held up due to the private bail industry. And this November, we will have the chance to vote for it and become the first state in the country that has eliminated cash bail. Sentencing reform, this is an example of this is, for example, in Delaware, there exist different sentences for drug violations based on whether or not you were within a certain distance of a school. This disproportionately affects urban areas and people of color. And an example of a reform that passed is that there was a recent Senate bill that eliminated that disparity. Expanding the vote. So the most high-profile example of this was Measure 4 in Florida back in November 2018, which Floridians overwhelmingly voted for, which restored the right to vote to ex-felons. Many of you guys may have seen the headlines in the news this week where this, despite it being passed by such a large majority, was held up in the courts because although ex-felons have technically been restored the right to vote, they were being held up and they had to pay all their prison fees and before they were able to vote, and this was officially just declared by a court that is discriminatory, which should hopefully restore the right to vote for millions of people, especially for this upcoming election. So banning the box is another type of criminal justice reform. I mentioned earlier that the box that is often seen on many applications for employment or education asks you to disclose a criminal record. So there is a campaign to ban this question. You know, people who have a record have served their time. They've been deemed to be safe to be out in the community again. They've served their time, and that punishment shouldn't follow them for the rest of their lives. There have been reforms challenging racial disparity. For example, there are laws called racial impact statements that allow a bill to be scrutinized for potential unintended consequences that would disproportionately affect people of color. There's been a lot of reforms for justice involve the youth, allowing juveniles to be in community-based programs rather than being incarcerated and tried as adults. And of course, there's been a lot of work around phasing private prisons. On the right here is a photo of Chesa Boudin, the District Attorney of San Francisco. He is really one of the people leading the efforts towards decarceration and criminal justice reform here in the Bay Area, and I just wanted to highlight that. But people like him wouldn't get elected and wouldn't be here if it weren't for incredible activists and grassroots organizers. I always like this Scooby-Doo meme. I think about this very often. I know it's very weird, but I always think about how power changes nothing without a demand, and so we owe a lot of this progress to activists. And I'm going to give a few examples of resistance. So many of you might have heard about the 2018 prison strike, which involved folks who were in 17 prisons across the U.S. It took place on the anniversary of a famous prison strike in 1971, the Attica prison strike, and a lot of incarcerated folks engaged in hunger strikes and work stoppages, refusing their essentially free labor. They faced significant retaliation with solitary confinement and removal of communication privileges and prison transfers. This is a list of their demands. And when I read this, I was so moved. And we obviously don't have time to go to every single one, but I think what's really important to highlight about this is that nobody here is demanding that they not be held responsible for whatever it is that got them incarcerated. What they are asking for is the end of prison slavery. They are asking for things like an anti-racist approach to sentencing. And I just think about the incredible courage it takes to have participated in this strike, and how, as a privileged person who has not firsthand experienced our prison system, how important it is to listen to this. This is another example very recently. A journalist was able to sneak in a camera and get some footage of people who are stuck in ICE detention here in California at the Mesa Verde Detention Center in Bakersfield. They submitted this incredibly powerful video asking to be reunited with their families and expressing their fear that detention would become a death sentence for them during COVID-19. Many ICE detainees have been participating in hunger strikes and petitioning for decarceration. This is an example through the Ella Baker Center, which is an amazing organization right here in the Bay Area. It's based in Oakland. Prisoners started donating postage stamps to the Ella Baker Center, to these organizations that have been advocating for them. A postage stamp is about a day's wage for many prisoners. And so it's a huge sacrifice for them to be doing this, in which this led to the One Day's Wage campaign, in which people were encouraged to donate a day's wage to support the Ella Baker Center and other organizations doing this kind of advocacy, which a couple of friends and I participated in. I want to spotlight a particular form of activism, which is known as bail funds. So basically, bail funds are funds that are held by organizations, that are raised by organizations to raise money to bail people out of jail. So like I said, 2/3 of people who are currently sitting in jail are only there because they cannot afford bail. And so what these bail funds do is that they raise the money in order to post it so that people can go home. Obviously, it's not true bail reform, but it's something we can do, and so true bail reform passes. And I would argue that it actually has a lot of impact, not just on individuals, but on the roots of this problem. It gets people home, and it's thought to be kind of a laboratory that can inform true criminal justice reform. So, for example, the Bronx Freedom Fund, which is the oldest bail fund, showed that when they posted bail, 96% of people still appeared on their court date. And sometimes this is not just one court date. This is like 15 appearances in court. And so what they showed is that even if it's not people's own money on the line, people are still showing up and cooperating to and coming to their trials. Of these people, 55% had the charges dropped. They weren't even found to be guilty. And many of these people are people who would have pled guilty in order to just go home and get caught up in the system forever. So bail funds are really inspiring to me, and I wanted to highlight it. On the left is a photo of a young man named Khalif Browder, who many of you might know this high-profile story. He was a 19-year-old boy in the Bronx who was wrongfully accused of stealing a backpack. He was unable to pay the $10,000 bail and ended up in Rikers for 3 years. When he was finally released, he ended up committing suicide within 2 weeks of his release. And his story, I think, really highlights the desperate need for bail reform and for criminal justice reform in general. Okay, I'm going to specifically highlight this one bail fund that is my favorite. It's amazing. It's called the National Bailout, and every year they are a Black woman-led organization. Every year they run the Black Mamas Bailouts, which is a campaign to bail out Black moms and caregivers in times for Mother's Day. They have bailed out over 400 Black mothers since 2017, not even including this year's bailouts. This is an example of the work that they did this year, and on the right we have a photo of a Black mama who was bailed out so that she can go home and be with her kids and be home while she awaits her trial. I want to highlight specifically this one mini campaign that many of us participated in, because I don't believe in having all this depressing information without next steps that we can take, and I want to give a concrete example of things that physicians can do. So this was maternity care providers for the National Bailout. This was a little campaign that 8 of us started. We were 8 OB/GYN residents, and we wanted to support the National Bailout and help bail out Black mothers in time for Mother's Day. We felt there was a direct connection between our work as maternity care providers and the National Bailout's work. So we started an online campaign. These were graphics made by my friend Sophie, and we created a little website and took to social media, like everybody else. And we were able to raise almost $9,000 and had 82 participants. And this is everybody, well, not everybody, but many people who participated. The vast majority of us were residents, so we didn't necessarily have a ton of money to give, but I thought that there was so much power and so much we could do if we worked together. And this is something that we are going to come back to year after year and show up every Mother's Day to help support this incredibly important work. This is our website if you want to take a look. Other actions that people can take. So again, I mentioned that we are going to have an opportunity to vote for bail reform on November 3rd. I encourage us to all get out there. We can write to incarcerated people. We're all doctors. We chose this field because we value one-on-one relationships, and this is an incredibly important way you can support somebody going through something incredibly difficult. We can make phone calls to demand the release of vulnerable detainees. These are pictures from such actions. And a particular group I want to highlight is a group called Doctors for Camp Closure. This is a picture of them on the upper left here. They are a really, really powerful group that are currently holding 24-hour vigils outside of ICE detention centers, really trying to call to attention this need for decarceration during COVID-19. Another group called Healers for Abolition. There's a lot of overlap between those two groups. And then there's so many other groups that we can volunteer for, make phone calls for, or simply donate to. I want to end on this quote that I've been thinking about a lot. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. So I wanted to read you this quote. I know we're all looking for a little bit of hope. I think the way we are reimagining many things in this pandemic, including our need for mass incarceration, is giving me hope, and getting involved in this work is giving me a lot of hope. So if anybody is interested, please don't hesitate to reach out. I'm going to leave my email there, and shoot me a message. I'd love to hear from you, and I'd love to work together. These are my references, and that's it. I know it's 1:15 already, but I'll hang out if anybody has questions. Thank you.